I have stood in rooms filled with generals, ministers, businessmen, and men who carried enough influence to change the fate of nations. But the most unforgettable moment I have ever witnessed did not happen during a military operation, a political summit, or a speech before cameras. It happened in silence. It happened late at night, after a meeting about Africa's suffering had already ended. And it happened when a man named Raymond Zondo lowered his head and cried after hearing me speak about Jesus Christ. I know some people may find that strange. Others may think this is a religious story. But it is not only about religion. It is about pain. It is about power. It is about the human heart. And it is about what happens when a man who has spent years surrounded by conflict suddenly hears words that awaken something buried deep inside him. My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am not telling this story as a preacher. I am not trying to convince anyone to follow a religion. I speak only as a man who has lived inside pressure, struggle, and responsibility. Every day of my life is connected to the hopes of my people. I have seen fear in villages. I have seen young men carrying weapons before they were old enough to fully understand life. I have seen mothers who no longer cry because grief has exhausted them. I have seen how power can corrupt good intentions. And I have also seen how suffering can either destroy a human being or force him to search for deeper meaning. That is why I remember that meeting so clearly. The gathering itself was not extraordinary at first. Several people had come together to discuss the condition of Africa. The room was heavy with frustration. Some spoke about war. Others spoke about poverty. Some blamed foreign interference. Others blamed African leaders themselves. Everyone had statistics. Everyone had strategies. But behind all the words, I could feel something else in the room. Exhaustion. A spiritual exhaustion. The feeling that too many people had spent years fighting battles without knowing whether humanity itself was still capable of healing. That was when I noticed Raymond Zondo. He sat quietly near the corner of the room. He barely spoke during the discussions. Most people there were eager to be heard, but Raymond remained silent. And sometimes silence reveals more than speeches. His face carried the weight of experience. Not the experience of comfort, the experience of disappointment. His eyes looked cold at first. Not cold because he lacked emotion. Cold because he had seen too much pain to trust words easily anymore. I recognized that look immediately. Many men in leadership develop it over time. When you witness betrayal again and again, your heart begins protecting itself. You stop believing quickly. You stop expecting goodness from people. You begin living in survival mode. That was the atmosphere surrounding him. After the meeting ended, several people left quickly, but Raymond stayed behind. A few of us continued speaking quietly. There were no cameras, no journalists, no prepared speeches, only honest conversation. At some point, the discussion moved away from politics. We began speaking about leadership itself, about sacrifice, about justice, about whether humanity still had examples worth following. And that was when I spoke about Jesus, not as a priest, not as a theologian, but as a man trying to understand the meaning of courage and sacrifice in a broken world. I looked at Raymond and said something simple. I told him there was once a man who had no army, yet entire empires feared him. A man who owned no throne, yet billions still speak his name thousands of years later. A man who never commanded soldiers, yet transformed history more deeply than kings. That man was Jesus. Raymond did not interrupt me. He simply listened. The room became quiet again, and I realized something important in that moment. Sometimes people are not searching for arguments. Sometimes they are searching for truth powerful enough to reach beyond their pain. That night would become one of the most emotional conversations I have ever experienced. And before it ended, I would see tears in the eyes of a man who looked like he had forgotten how to cry. When I began speaking about Jesus that night, I made one thing clear immediately. I was not trying to convert Raymond. I was not trying to debate religion. Too many people in this world use religion as a weapon. Too many leaders hide behind sacred words while ignoring human suffering. I did not want that kind of conversation. What moved me about Jesus was not ceremony. It was not buildings. It was not power structures created by men. What moved me was the spirit of resistance inside the life of Jesus himself. I told Raymond that when I look at Jesus, I do not first see religion. I see a revolutionary. Not the kind of revolutionary driven by hatred, not the kind who dreams only about destroying enemies. I see a revolutionary who defended human dignity in a world built on fear and domination. That is what caught my attention long ago when I first reflected deeply on his story. Jesus was born among ordinary people. He did not grow up surrounded by luxury. He did not come from political royalty. He walked among workers, fishermen, widows, the poor, the rejected. And despite having no military force, he spoke with a confidence that frightened powerful men. That fascinated me, because throughout history, empires usually fear weapons. But sometimes the thing they fear most is truth spoken without fear. I looked at Raymond and said quietly, "The powerful were not afraid because Jesus carried a sword. They were afraid because he exposed their hypocrisy." Raymond remained silent, but his eyes stayed fixed on me. I continued. I told him that Jesus challenged systems that crushed human beings. He spoke against religious leaders who used faith to control people instead of helping them. He defended the weak publicly. He touched people society considered untouchable. He refused to worship wealth. And perhaps most dangerous of all, he reminded ordinary people that they also possessed value. That is always dangerous to oppressive systems, because when human beings rediscover dignity, fear begins to weaken. I told Raymond something I have come to believe deeply. A man who speaks truth without fear becomes difficult to control. That is why history remembers such people, not because they were perfect, but because they refused to bow completely before injustice. I explained to him that many revolutions fail because they replace one oppressor with another. A group suffers under power. They rise against it. Then once they gain control, they begin repeating the same cruelty themselves. The faces change, but the suffering remains. Jesus represented something different. His rebellion was rooted in conscience. He confronted corruption, but he also confronted hatred inside the human heart. That is much harder. Any man can pick up a weapon, but very few can confront evil without becoming consumed by it themselves. Raymond leaned back slightly in his chair, still silent, still listening. The room around us felt distant by then. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed. People lived their ordinary lives. But inside that room, the conversation had become deeply personal. I told him that one of the most remarkable things about Jesus was his complete lack of worldly protection. No palace, no fortune, no private army, no political machine. Yet powerful authorities treated him like a threat. Why? Because truth carries a strange kind of force. A ruler can silence critics for a season. A government can imprison opponents. An empire can spread fear. But once people begin recognizing truth inside themselves, control becomes harder. That is why so many great figures throughout history were persecuted. Not because they were violent, but because they awakened courage in others. I told Raymond, a man who tells the truth always frightens those who profit from lies. When I said those words, I noticed something change in his expression. Very small, but visible. The hardness in his face weakened for a moment. Not entirely, but enough for me to understand that something inside him recognized what I was saying. I did not know all his private struggles, but I knew enough about leadership to recognize exhaustion. Leadership is not only pressure from enemies. Sometimes the deepest exhaustion comes from disappointment in human beings. You fight for justice, then you discover corruption among your own allies. You trust people, then betrayal appears. You dream about freedom, then politics transforms noble goals into personal ambition. Over time, cynicism grows quietly, and cynicism is dangerous because it slowly kills hope. I think Raymond had experienced that, maybe more than most people realized. That was why the story of Jesus mattered in that moment, not as theology, as a reminder that courage can survive even inside corrupted systems. A reminder that human dignity does not depend on wealth or titles. A reminder that moral authority sometimes becomes stronger than political authority. I remember telling him something that night which I had never expressed publicly before. I said that many modern leaders misunderstand strength. They think strength means domination, control, fear, the ability to force obedience. But Jesus revealed another form of strength entirely. The strength to remain truthful while suffering. The strength to refuse hatred even while confronting injustice. The strength to stand alone if necessary. That kind of strength is rare. And because it is rare, it changes people deeply when they encounter it. Raymond finally spoke after a long silence. His voice was calm, but heavy. He asked me, "Do you really believe a man like that could survive in today's world?" I paused before answering, because it was an honest question. Today's world rewards manipulation. It rewards spectacle. It rewards selfishness disguised as leadership. People who remain sincere are often mocked. People who sacrifice themselves for others are often used and discarded. So I understood why he asked. I told him the world might reject such a man again, maybe even crucify him again in different ways. But I also told him something else. Human beings never stop longing for truth. Even when society becomes cynical, even when corruption spreads everywhere, people still recognize authenticity when they encounter it. That is why the story of Jesus survives. Not because every institution is pure, not because all believers are righteous, but because something inside the human soul still responds to compassion, courage, and sacrifice. I told Raymond that empires rise and fall, political systems change, borders move, power shifts constantly, but certain truths survive generations. The truth that human beings deserve dignity, the truth that the weak matter, the truth that love can outlive violence, the truth that sacrifice can transform hearts more deeply than fear ever could. Jesus represented those truths, and that was why his story remained dangerous. Dangerous to oppression, dangerous to corruption, dangerous to systems built on dehumanizing people. Because once someone truly believes they possess dignity given by God, it becomes difficult to enslave their spirit completely. At some point, Raymond lowered his eyes briefly, not dramatically, just enough for me to sense the conversation was reaching somewhere deeper than politics. I realized then that this discussion was no longer intellectual. It had become personal for both of us. I was no longer speaking only about Jesus. I was speaking about Africa, about leadership, about suffering, about what kind of men we choose to become after witnessing pain. I told him I did not admire Jesus because he conquered nations. I admired him because he refused to abandon humanity even when humanity abandoned him. That, to me, was revolutionary. And I believe Raymond understood exactly what I meant. After speaking about courage and truth, I began speaking about something even more difficult. Love. Not the weak version of love people often speak about casually. Not emotion without responsibility. I spoke about the kind of love that demands sacrifice. The kind of love that forces a person to place the suffering of others before personal comfort. That was the part of the story that changed the atmosphere completely. I told Raymond that one of the reasons Jesus continues to move people across generations is because he stood beside those society preferred to ignore. The poor, the sick, the rejected, the ashamed, the forgotten. Throughout history, powerful societies have always tried to separate human beings into categories. Important people, useless people, clean people, unworthy people, valuable people, disposable people. Jesus broke those walls constantly. That was revolutionary. I told Raymond that I often think about how unusual it was for a man surrounded by suffering to move toward broken people instead of away from them. Most human beings fear pain. We avoid it. We hide from it. We distance ourselves from those whose suffering reminds us how fragile life really is. But Jesus walked directly into human pain. He touched the sick. He spoke with outcasts. He forgave people others condemned. That kind of compassion requires enormous strength. I remember telling Raymond, anyone can love people when life is easy. But loving wounded people without expecting anything in return is rare. He nodded slowly. Only once. But I could feel he understood. The conversation had become quieter by then. Not quiet because there was nothing left to say. Quiet because some truths force people inward. I continued speaking carefully. I told him that one part of the story of Jesus had always remained in my mind more than anything else. Not the miracles, not the crowds, not the fame, the sacrifice. I looked directly at Raymond and said something that still stays with me today. Jesus did not kill to save people. He accepted death to save people. After I said those words, the room felt heavier. Because modern society understands power through violence. We understand domination. We understand revenge. We understand punishment. But sacrifice confuses people, especially sacrificial love. The willingness to suffer for others instead of making others suffer for you. That kind of strength appears almost impossible in today's world. I told Raymond that many leaders speak about serving people. Very few truly sacrifice for them. Some sacrifice comfort temporarily. Some sacrifice popularity. But true sacrifice changes a person completely. Jesus accepted humiliation, fine, abandonment, betrayal, and according to the story, he still chose forgiveness instead of hatred. I admitted to Raymond that this is one of the hardest teachings for any human being to understand, especially for men who have witnessed violence, especially for leaders responsible for protecting nations. Because anger often feels more natural than mercy. Hatred often feels more justified than forgiveness. I told him honestly that even I struggle sometimes when I think about injustice, when innocent people suffer, when foreign interests exploit weak nations, when corruption destroys futures, when children grow up surrounded by fear, there are moments when rage feels easier than compassion. But then I remember something important. Hatred can begin as resistance against evil, but if it grows unchecked, eventually it transforms the victim into another source of destruction. That is how cycles of violence survive across generations. I told Raymond that Africa has suffered too many cycles already. Colonization, exploitation, civil wars, political manipulation, economic dependency, foreign interference, betrayal from within. The continent carries deep wounds, and wounded people can easily become consumed by bitterness. I understand why, but I also know bitterness alone cannot build a future. I leaned slightly forward and told him something I believe with all my heart. We are not fighting to become new oppressors. If our struggle only replaces one form of cruelty with another, then we have learned nothing. Raymond looked at me differently after that, not as a politician speaking. As a man speaking from conviction, I explained that the future of Africa cannot be built only through anger. Anger can awaken resistance, but it cannot sustain justice by itself. A nation also needs dignity, compassion, discipline, moral purpose. Otherwise, revolution eventually collapses into chaos. Jesus understood something many leaders forget. Human beings need more than survival, they need meaning. That is why people followed him. Not because he promised luxury, but because he restored dignity to people who had lost it. I told Raymond that when Jesus sat with the poor, he was doing more than charity. He was declaring that their lives mattered. When he touched the sick, he was rejecting the idea that suffering made someone worthless. When he forgave sinners, he was reminding humanity that failure does not erase human value forever. These were not small acts. They challenged entire systems of exclusion. And that is why the powerful feared him, not because he commanded armies, because he restored hope to the people most easily controlled by despair. I paused for a moment then. I could see Raymond listening carefully now, not guarded anymore, not skeptical. Something softer had entered his expression. And so I continued deeper. I told him that modern civilization has become obsessed with appearing strong. Leaders want to appear untouchable. Governments want to appear invincible. People hide vulnerability because they fear being judged. But Jesus revealed strength differently. He wept openly. He suffered openly. He loved openly. And somehow that vulnerability became a source of immense spiritual power. I asked Raymond quietly, what kind of man chooses love even when hatred would be easier? He did not answer immediately. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he finally said something very softly. Very few men. I could hear exhaustion in his voice. Not physical exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has carried emotional weight for many years. I understood it well. Leadership changes people internally. You witness things ordinary citizens never see. You learn how fragile societies truly are. You discover how quickly fear spreads. You watch ambition destroy friendships. You see how greed corrupts noble causes. Over time, part of the heart becomes defensive, sometimes numb. That was why this conversation mattered. Because beneath political discussions, we were really speaking about the survival of the human spirit. I told Raymond that I often fear one thing more than military threats. I fear leaders losing their humanity. Once a leader stops seeing people as human beings, destruction follows quickly. A nation becomes numbers instead of families. Power becomes addiction instead of responsibility. Violence becomes strategy instead of tragedy. Jesus never treated people that way. Even while confronting corruption, he continued seeing humanity inside broken individuals. That is difficult, very difficult, especially in violent times. I admitted honestly that I do not pretend to possess such perfection myself. No leader does. We all struggle. We all become angry. We all carry wounds. But the story of Jesus reminds humanity of what moral courage can look like even in darkness. That reminder matters, especially for societies losing faith in goodness itself. At one point, I remember telling Raymond something that surprised even me while I said it aloud. I told him that perhaps the greatest crisis in the modern world is not economic, not military, not political. It is spiritual emptiness. People have information everywhere, but wisdom is disappearing. People are connected through technology, but loneliness grows. People chase success constantly, but many no longer understand purpose. Jesus spoke directly into that emptiness. not by promising easy lives, but by reminding humanity that love, sacrifice, and mercy still possess meaning. Raymond sat very still after that. His eyes no longer looked cold. They looked tired and deeply reflective. I could sense memories moving inside him, perhaps regrets, perhaps disappointments, perhaps hopes he once carried before life hardened him. That is what truth sometimes does. It opens doors inside people that have remained locked for years. I told him one final thing before the conversation shifted again. I said that history remembers conquerors for a season, but humanity remembers those who heal hearts for generations. Jesus healed hearts. That was his revolution. And maybe, I told Raymond, that is the only kind of revolution capable of saving the world permanently. For a long time after that, Raymond said nothing. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt heavy with thought. I could see something changing inside him slowly, not suddenly, not dramatically, but the kind of change that begins quietly before it reaches the surface. At the beginning of our conversation, he had listened with the guarded expression of a man who trusted very little. Now the hardness in his face had weakened. His eyes no longer looked distant. They looked inward, as if he had begun searching through memories he normally tried to avoid. I understood that feeling. Sometimes truth does not attack the mind first. It reaches the heart. And once the heart begins responding, the mind can no longer hide comfortably behind cynicism. I continued speaking softly, not trying to impress him, not trying to win an argument, only speaking honestly. I told Raymond that there was one moment in the story of Jesus that had always shaken me more deeply than anything else. Not the miracles, not the crowds following him, not even the crucifixion itself. What shook me most was what Jesus said while suffering on the cross. I looked directly at Raymond and said quietly, he asked forgiveness for the people killing him. The room became completely still again. Even now, when I think back to that moment, I remember how deeply those words affected the atmosphere around us. Because forgiveness sounds beautiful when spoken casually, but forgiveness during suffering is something entirely different. Most people can speak about peace when life is comfortable, but when betrayed, humiliated, wounded, or attacked, another side of human nature appears. Anger, revenge, hatred, the desire to make others feel pain equal to our own. That instinct exists in nearly everyone, including leaders, including soldiers, including men who speak about justice. I told Raymond honestly that when I think about violence in the world, I understand why hatred grows. People suffer terrible losses. Families are destroyed. Communities collapse. Nations are humiliated. And once pain enters the heart deeply enough, forgiveness can begin feeling almost impossible. That is why the words of Jesus on the cross carry such power, because they challenge something fundamental inside human beings. They challenge the belief that hatred is the final answer to suffering. I asked Raymond quietly, what kind of strength does a man need to forgive while dying? He lowered his head slightly, still silent. I continued. I explained that many people misunderstand forgiveness. They think forgiveness means weakness, submission, accepting injustice. But true forgiveness is not surrender to evil. It is refusal to allow evil to completely poison the soul. That requires enormous strength, especially for people who have seen cruelty closely. I told Raymond that Africa carries many wounds that remain unresolved. Some wounds come from history. Others come from betrayal within our own societies. Entire generations have grown up surrounded by instability and fear, and pain that remains untreated eventually transforms itself into rage. Sometimes justified rage, but rage alone cannot heal human beings. I said something then that came directly from my heart. If suffering only teaches us how to hate, then suffering has defeated us completely. Raymond slowly raised his eyes toward me again, and that was the moment I saw it. Fine. Real pain. Not political frustration. Not intellectual disagreement. Something personal. Something buried deeply. His eyes had changed completely now. The coldness I noticed earlier was gone. In its place was exhaustion mixed with emotion he was struggling to contain. I realized then that this conversation had stopped being about history or religion. It had become about the wounds men carry silently for years, especially men taught never to show weakness. I know that world well. Leadership teaches people to hide emotion constantly. A leader is expected to remain composed, strong, controlled, even while carrying enormous pressure internally. Over time, many leaders stop speaking honestly about their pain altogether, and when pain remains trapped long enough, it hardens the heart. I think Raymond recognized that truth inside himself during our conversation. I continued carefully. I told him that one reason the story of Jesus survives across centuries is because it speaks directly to wounded people. Not perfect people. Wounded people. People carrying guilt, anger, disappointment, loneliness, regret, fear. Jesus did not spend his time only with the successful or admired. He moved toward broken humanity. That matters deeply, because many people secretly believe they are too damaged to change, too damaged to deserve peace, too damaged to deserve forgiveness. But the message of Jesus challenges that hopelessness. I remember saying to Raymond, the world teaches people to hide their scars, but Jesus spoke directly to scars. At that moment, Raymond suddenly looked away. His eyes became red. He tried to remain composed. I could see him fighting emotion internally. And then, quietly, he lowered his head. Tears began falling, not loudly, not dramatically, but real tears. Deep tears. The kind that emerge when someone has carried emotional weight for far too long. I did not interrupt him. I did not try to comfort him immediately. Some moments are too sacred for quick words. So I remained silent beside him. And while he cried quietly, I thought about something important. People often assume powerful men do not break emotionally. That is not true. Power does not remove pain. Sometimes it increases it. Because powerful people often carry responsibility without having safe places to release their grief. Many leaders spend years pretending to be stronger than they truly feel. Eventually, the soul becomes exhausted. I think that night, Raymond's soul became exhausted from hiding, and the story of Jesus reached a place inside him untouched for many years. After several moments, he finally spoke again. His voice was quieter than before. He asked me something I will never forget. He said, "Do you think a man can still change after becoming hard for so long?" That question touched me deeply, because underneath politics, titles, and reputation, that is one of the greatest fears human beings carry. The fear that it may be too late to become better, too late to heal, too late to rediscover peace. I answered him honestly. I told him that if I did not believe human beings could change, I would have lost hope for the world long ago. Nations change because people change. Families heal because people change. Communities recover because people change. And individuals rediscover meaning because something awakens inside them again. That awakening is powerful. I told Raymond that tears are not always signs of weakness. Sometimes tears are signs that the soul is still alive, still capable of feeling truth, still capable of compassion, still capable of transformation. A man completely consumed by hatred no longer cries like that. A man whose heart is entirely dead no longer responds to mercy. That is why his tears moved me. Not because emotion itself impressed me, but because they revealed something human surviving beneath years of pain. I told him that many people today laugh at compassion. They celebrate hardness. They confuse cruelty with strength. But a civilization without mercy eventually destroys itself. Because human beings cannot survive spiritually on fear and anger alone. We need hope. We need meaning. We need forgiveness. We need reminders that darkness is not the only force shaping human history. That is what Jesus represented to millions across generations. Hope stronger than despair. Love stronger than humiliation. Mercy stronger than vengeance. Raymond listened quietly again, but now there was no resistance in him, only reflection, and perhaps relief. Relief that someone had finally spoken to the hidden exhaustion inside his heart instead of only speaking to his political opinions. That matters more than many people realize. Most conversations today remain on the surface. Politics, ideology, arguments, performance. Very few people speak honestly about suffering itself, about loneliness, about fear, about the emotional cost of leadership and conflict. But those hidden wounds shape nations more than speeches do. I remember telling Raymond one final thing before the night moved forward. I said, "A man who still feels compassion has not lost himself completely." When he heard those words, he closed his eyes briefly. And I understood that something inside him had shifted permanently. Not because of me, not because of persuasion, but because truth has strange power when it reaches a wounded heart at the right moment. That night, Raymond Zondo cried. Not because he was weak, not because he was defeated, but because for the first time in many years, he felt something stronger than bitterness. Hope. After Raymond cried, neither of us spoke for a while. The silence no longer felt heavy in a painful way. It felt honest. Sometimes human beings spend years hiding behind words because silence threatens to expose what they truly feel. But that night, silence became part of the conversation itself. I sat there thinking about how strange life can be. A man may survive conflict, political pressure, betrayal, and hardship without breaking. Then one simple truth reaches his heart, and suddenly all the walls he built begin collapsing quietly. That is what I believe happened to Raymond. And the more I reflected on it, the more I understood something important. People are not moved most deeply by religion alone. They are moved by truth. Real truth. The kind that forces human beings to confront themselves honestly. I finally spoke again and told Raymond something I have believed for a long time. Jesus did not come only to judge humanity. He came to awaken it. That is why his story continues surviving through centuries. Not because every institution built around his name remained pure. History proves otherwise. Human beings corrupt many things. Politics, religion, power, movements, even noble ideas. But despite all human failures, the figure of Jesus continues reaching hearts because his life acts like a mirror forcing people to examine themselves, their fears, their bitterness, their selfishness, their capacity for love, and also their possibility of becoming better. That possibility matters deeply, especially for wounded people. I looked at Raymond and told him something directly. The reason this conversation hurts is because truth touches places we usually protect. He listened quietly. I could see he understood now. Not only intellectually, personally. There are moments in life when a person suddenly recognizes how far he has drifted from peace. I think Raymond reached such a moment that night. He had spent years surrounded by conflict, pressure, disappointment, and distrust. Over time, those experiences change people internally. You begin expecting betrayal before loyalty. You begin expecting corruption before sincerity. You begin preparing emotionally for disappointment constantly. That kind of life slowly disconnects human beings from hope. Not all at once. Gradually. Quietly. And many people do not even realize it is happening until one day they no longer recognize themselves emotionally. I think the story of Jesus forced Raymond to look directly at that reality. Not through guilt. Through honesty. That distinction matters. Because Jesus did not awaken people through humiliation. He awakened them through truth mixed with mercy. That combination is powerful. Truth alone can crush people. Mercy alone can become meaningless sentiment. But truth combined with mercy creates the possibility of transformation. I told Raymond that many societies today operate without mercy. People are reduced to categories immediately. Useful, useless, good, bad, enemy, ally, success, failure. Human beings become labels instead of souls. But Jesus consistently looked deeper than labels. That was revolutionary. He saw humanity even inside flawed individuals. That does not mean he ignored wrongdoing, but he refused to believe failure was the final identity of a person. I remember saying to Raymond, hatred cannot heal a wounded soul. It only spreads the wound further. Those words stayed hanging in the room for several seconds, because both of us understood how difficult they were, especially in a violent world, especially for nations carrying historical pain, especially for leaders forced to make difficult decisions. I spoke honestly with him then about Africa again. Our continent has experienced enormous suffering, and suffering leaves emotional scars not only on individuals but on entire societies. Communities traumatized for generations begin normalizing fear. Children inherit bitterness from exhausted parents. Violence becomes familiar. Distrust becomes natural. That is dangerous, because eventually people stop believing healing is even possible. I told Raymond that this may be one of the greatest victories evil can achieve. Not physical destruction alone, but convincing humanity that compassion is weakness and healing is impossible. Jesus challenged exactly that despair. He walked into hopeless places and restored dignity to people who believed their lives no longer mattered. That is why his presence transformed hearts. Not because he offered political domination, but because he restored meaning. Meaning is essential for human survival. Without meaning, societies decay internally even if they appear successful externally. People become spiritually empty, angry, lost, disconnected from one another. I told Raymond that modern civilization suffers greatly from this emptiness. Many people possess material comfort yet remain emotionally restless. Many leaders possess influence yet feel deeply isolated. Many nations possess technology yet struggle to preserve humanity itself. That is why the message of Jesus still reaches people. Because beneath politics and ideology, human beings remain hungry for purpose, hungry for forgiveness, hungry for hope, hungry for reassurance that goodness still matters. Raymond listened carefully while I spoke. His tears had stopped by then, but his face remained emotional, more open, more human, less guarded, and I realized something else during that conversation. Sometimes people do not need solutions immediately. Sometimes they need recognition. Recognition that their pain exists. Recognition that their soul has become tired. Recognition that they have not completely lost themselves despite years of hardship. I think Raymond needed that recognition deeply. Many strong men secretly do. The world praises strength constantly, but rarely asks strong people how much carrying strength has cost them emotionally. That cost can become enormous. I told Raymond something personal then. I admitted that leadership sometimes frightens me. Not because of enemies, not because of political danger, but because power constantly tests the soul. A leader can slowly begin believing he exists above ordinary human beings, above accountability, above humility, above compassion. That corruption often begins invisibly, and once it fully enters the heart, destruction follows naturally. Jesus represented the opposite of that corruption. Despite possessing influence over people, he remained humble. Despite being followed, he served others. Despite being betrayed, he continued loving humanity. That example matters profoundly for leadership. Because the world does not suffer from lack of powerful individuals. It suffers from lack of morally grounded individuals. I told Raymond that history repeatedly proves something tragic. Human beings often become what they once hated if they lose moral direction. Victims become oppressors. Liberators become tyrants. Movements for justice become systems of domination. That cycle repeats across generations because external revolution without internal transformation eventually collapses. Jesus focused first on the human heart. That was his revolution. Not merely changing rulers, changing people internally. I know some people reject such ideas because they sound too idealistic. But I have lived long enough to know weapons alone cannot save societies. Military victories without moral renewal only delay future crises. A nation also needs conscience. Disciplina, merite, shared dignity. Without those things, instability eventually returns in another form. Raymond finally spoke again after listening for a long time. His voice sounded calmer now. He said quietly, "Maybe that is why so many people remain angry even after gaining power." I nodded immediately, because he had understood something important. External success does not automatically heal internal wounds. A bitter man with power often becomes more dangerous than a powerless bitter man. That is why spiritual emptiness matters politically too. A leader disconnected from compassion eventually harms his people, even if his original intentions were sincere. I told Raymond that one reason the story of Jesus survives through centuries is because it constantly reminds humanity of forgotten truths. That pride destroys wisdom. That greed destroys justice. That hatred destroys peace. And that love, despite appearing weak, can transform lives more deeply than fear ever will. I know many modern people struggle with such ideas. The world rewards aggression visibly, but healing usually happens quietly, patiently, inside hearts first. That night, I watched healing begin quietly inside Raymond. Not complete healing. No human conversation can erase years of pain immediately. But something awakened, and awakening matters. Because before transformation comes awareness, a person must first recognize his own exhaustion before searching for peace again. I believe Raymond recognized that exhaustion fully for the first time that night. Before we ended our conversation, I told him something I hope he never forgets. I said, "The fact that your heart still responds means darkness has not won inside you." He looked at me silently after that, and in his eyes I no longer saw the coldness from earlier that evening. I saw something far more powerful, the beginning of hope. As the night continued, our conversation moved naturally toward leadership itself. Not politics in the ordinary sense, not campaigns, not speeches, not public image. We spoke about the burden of guiding human beings through difficult times. And I remember telling Raymond something that had lived in my mind for years. A true leader does not stand above the people. A true leader walks with them. That sounds simple when spoken aloud, but very few people in power truly live that way. Power changes human beings quickly. The higher a person rises, the easier it becomes to stop listening, to stop seeing ordinary struggles, to become surrounded only by comfort, praise, and protection. Eventually, many leaders begin living in a different reality from their people. That separation is dangerous. Because once a leader stops feeling the pain of the people, leadership becomes performance instead of service. I told Raymond that this is one reason I continue thinking about Jesus so often. Because despite the influence he carried, he remained close to ordinary suffering. He walked among the poor. He ate with simple people. He listened to the rejected. He touched the sick. He never behaved as though human pain existed beneath him. That humility is rare, especially among powerful figures. I said quietly, "The world has many rulers, but very few servants." Raymond listened carefully. His expression remained thoughtful. I could see he was connecting these ideas not only to religion, but to political life itself. Because leadership reveals the true condition of the heart faster than almost anything else. A selfish man with power becomes dangerous. An arrogant man with power becomes destructive. A fearful man with power spreads fear. But a leader grounded in humility can strengthen an entire nation morally. That is why character matters more than image. Modern society often confuses visibility with greatness. People admire loudness, wealth, control, influence. But history eventually exposes empty leadership. Because leadership without moral purpose collapses inward over time. I told Raymond that Jesus represented perhaps the greatest example of servant leadership humanity has ever seen. Not because he conquered territory, but because he placed others before himself repeatedly. I reminded him of something remarkable. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. Even today, that image carries enormous meaning. A man respected by many lowering himself to serve others directly. Most rulers demand service. Very few choose humility willingly. That act alone challenges the entire psychology of power. I looked at Raymond and said, "A leader who cannot kneel before his people eventually begins ruling against them." He nodded slowly, and I continued. I told him that many revolutions fail because they focus only on removing external oppression while ignoring internal corruption. But corruption is not only political, it is spiritual. A leader consumed by ego eventually betrays the revolution even if he once believed in justice sincerely. That has happened throughout history many times. Movements born from noble suffering eventually become systems of fear themselves. Why? Because wounded human beings without moral discipline often reproduce the very cruelty they once resisted. That truth is painful, but necessary. I told Raymond that this is why I no longer believe hatred can sustain genuine liberation. Hatred can ignite resistance temporarily, but hatred alone cannot build healthy societies. Eventually it consumes everything. Trust disappears. Compassion disappears. Human dignity disappears. Then the revolution loses its soul. Jesus represented another path entirely. A revolution based on restoration instead of domination. A revolution seeking to heal human beings, not merely control them. I know some people hear words like love, mercy, and humility and immediately dismiss them as weakness. But I have seen enough suffering to know that cruelty is easy. Anyone can become cruel after enough pain. What is difficult is remaining human while confronting injustice. That is true strength. And Jesus demonstrated that strength constantly. I told Raymond something very honestly then. I said that sometimes I fear the future of leadership in the world. Too many leaders today seek admiration instead of responsibility. Too many seek power without sacrifice. Too many speak about the people while living disconnected from them entirely. That separation destroys trust. And once people lose trust completely, nations become unstable from within. A population can survive poverty for some time. It can survive hardship. But when people lose faith in the moral sincerity of leadership, despair spreads quickly. That despair becomes fertile ground for chaos. Jesus understood trust deeply. People followed him because they sensed sincerity, not perfection, sincerity. They believed he genuinely cared about human beings. That kind of moral authority becomes stronger than fear. Fear can force obedience temporarily, but only trust inspires lasting loyalty. I remember telling Raymond that the greatest leaders in history were not always the wealthiest or most powerful. Often they were individuals willing to sacrifice personally for the dignity of others. Sacrifice creates legitimacy. People recognize authenticity instinctively, especially suffering people. A hungry population can detect false leadership quickly. They know when leaders love power more than people. That is why humility matters politically too, not as performance, as genuine moral discipline. I told Raymond that when Jesus fed hungry people, he was doing more than charity. He was recognizing human dignity. When he healed the sick, he was affirming that forgotten people still mattered. When he forgave failures, he was restoring hope to those consumed by shame. That is leadership at its deepest level, not domination, restoration. I paused briefly then. The room felt calmer now than earlier in the night. Not lighter exactly, but clearer. Like two exhausted men had finally stopped speaking through political language and begun speaking honestly about humanity itself. I told Raymond that I believe the world misunderstands revolution completely. Most people imagine revolution only through violence, flex, weapons, governments collapsing. But external revolution without inner transformation rarely creates lasting peace. The human heart remains the battlefield underneath every political system. Greed, fear, pride, hatred. If those forces remain untouched, injustice eventually returns in another form. Jesus understood this profoundly. That is why his teachings focused constantly on the condition of the heart. Because societies become reflections of the people leading them. A corrupt people eventually create corrupt systems. A fearful people eventually create oppressive structures. A selfish people eventually abandon the vulnerable. Internal transformation matters. Not only laws and institutions. I remember saying to Raymond, the greatest prison is fear inside the human spirit. Fear controls societies more effectively than chains sometimes. Fear of poverty, fear of exclusion, fear of violence, fear of speaking truth, fear of losing power. Entire systems are built around manipulating those fears. But Jesus challenged fear repeatedly, not recklessly, courageously. That courage inspired people because courage spreads. So does hope. So does dignity. That is why one morally courageous individual can influence generations far beyond his lifetime. I told Raymond that Africa needs more than political independence. Africa also needs spiritual confidence, moral confidence, the belief that our people deserve dignity, purpose, and self-respect. Too many generations were taught indirectly that they existed only to survive exploitation. That psychological damage remains deep. A continent cannot fully rise while internally believing itself inferior. Jesus constantly restored dignity to broken people. That lesson matters beyond religion. It matters culturally, politically, humanly. Raymond listened without interrupting, and I sensed that something inside him was becoming peaceful for the first time that night. Not because all problems disappeared, but because truth sometimes relieves the soul even before circumstances change. I admitted something personal then. I told him leadership can become lonely in ways ordinary people rarely understand. A leader carries expectations constantly, pressure constantly, criticism constantly, danger constantly. Over time, many leaders emotionally isolate themselves for protection. But isolation slowly damages wisdom, because disconnected leaders stop hearing reality clearly. Jesus remained connected to ordinary humanity. That protected his moral clarity. He listened. He walked among people. He saw suffering directly. That matters. A leader hidden entirely behind walls eventually begins governing abstractions instead of human beings. I told Raymond, a nation is not statistics. It is mothers, children, workers, farmers, families, dreams, grief, hope. Once leadership forgets that, destruction begins quietly. He nodded again, and I could see emotion returning to his eyes, though no tears came this time. Only understanding, deep understanding. Before the conversation ended, I told him what kind of revolution I personally believe humanity needs most. Not a revolution fueled by endless revenge. Not a revolution that merely changes flags while preserving cruelty, but a revolution of restoration. A revolution that heals dignity, that frees people from fear, that teaches leaders humility, that protects the weak instead of exploiting them, that rebuilds moral courage. That kind of revolution begins inside hearts before it appears in governments. And that, I told Raymond, is why the life of Jesus still matters after thousands of years. Because he showed humanity another way to possess strength without losing compassion. Another way to resist evil without becoming consumed by hatred. Another way to lead without worshiping power. When I finished speaking, Raymond looked at me quietly for several moments. Then he said something simple. But very few men live that way. I answered him honestly. Yes, very few. But those few change history forever. That night stayed with me long after Raymond and I finally left that room. Not because it solved the problems of Africa. Not because one conversation can erase suffering from the world. But because it reminded me of something I never want to forget. Human beings are not changed most deeply by force. They are changed by truth mixed with love. I have seen governments use fear. I have seen armies use weapons. I have seen powerful nations use money, pressure, propaganda, and influence. All those things can control people temporarily, but they cannot heal the human soul. Only truth can do that. Only sacrifice can do that. Only genuine love can reach places inside people that fear never touches. When I think back to Raymond lowering his head and crying, I understand clearly now that he was not crying because of a speech. He was crying because the story of Jesus reminded him of something he feared had disappeared from the world. Mercy, hope, compassion, the possibility that human beings can still change before bitterness destroys them completely. That realization matters more than many people understand, because modern society trains people to appear strong at all times. Never vulnerable, never uncertain, never wounded. But underneath those masks, millions of people are exhausted emotionally. Entire nations are exhausted spiritually. People carry grief silently. Leaders carry pressure silently. Families carry pain silently. And many begin believing there is no way back to peace. That is why stories like the story of Jesus continue touching hearts generation after generation. Not because humanity has become perfect, but because humanity remains hungry for redemption. Hungry for meaning. Hungry for reassurance that goodness still possesses power. I remember walking outside after our conversation ended. The night air felt cooler then. The streets were quieter. And I kept thinking about one truth repeatedly. Power alone cannot save humanity. If power alone could save the world, history would already be peaceful. Humanity has possessed empires, armies, technology, and wealth for centuries. Yet suffering continues because the crisis inside humanity is deeper than politics alone. The human heart itself remains divided. Between greed and generosity, between hatred and mercy, between domination and service, between fear and courage. Jesus confronted that inner conflict directly. That is why his life still speaks across time. He showed that true strength is not the ability to crush others. True strength is remaining human while confronting darkness. That is far more difficult. I want people listening to this story to understand something clearly. I am not asking everyone to become religious. That is not my purpose. My purpose is simpler. I want people to understand that civilizations survive only when they preserve humanity inside themselves. A nation without compassion eventually becomes unstable. A leadership without humility eventually becomes corrupt. A people consumed entirely by hatred eventually destroy their own future. This is true everywhere. In Africa, in America, across the world. That is why love matters politically too, even if many people laugh at the idea. Not weak love. Responsible love. Sacrificial love. Love connected to justice, dignity, and truth. Jesus represented that kind of love. And that is why his example remains revolutionary even now. I believe Raymond understood this before we parted ways that night. I think he realized his tears were not signs of weakness. They were signs that part of his soul still refused to die. That matters enormously. Because once a human being loses the ability to feel compassion completely, destruction becomes easy. History proves this repeatedly. The worst atrocities in human history happen when people stop seeing one another as human beings. Once dignity disappears, cruelty expands naturally. That is why restoring dignity is one of the greatest responsibilities of leadership. Not only economic dignity, human dignity, spiritual dignity, the belief that every life possesses value. Jesus defended that truth constantly. That is why his words continue surviving while empires disappear. And perhaps that is what touched Raymond most deeply. The realization that despite all the suffering, betrayal, and violence he had witnessed, his heart was still capable of recognizing truth when it appeared before him. Hope survived inside him after all. I believe many people listening to me now understand this feeling personally. Life hardens people slowly. Disappointment accumulates. Trust becomes difficult. Some people begin expecting pain everywhere. Others bury themselves in anger because anger feels safer than vulnerability. But eventually, every human being reaches a moment when they must decide what kind of person suffering will create inside them. Will pain produce wisdom or bitterness? Will hardship produce compassion or cruelty? Will leadership produce humility or pride? Those questions matter more than ideology, and no society escapes them. I think often about Africa when reflecting on these things. Our continent has suffered greatly, yet I still believe deeply in our people. I believe Africa possesses enormous spiritual strength despite everything it has endured. I believe ordinary African people still understand community, sacrifice, family, resilience, and dignity in ways the modern world sometimes forgets. But we must protect those values carefully, because the modern world constantly encourages selfishness, constantly encourages division, constantly teaches people to worship money and power above humanity itself. If we lose our moral center, independence alone will not save us. That is why I continue believing leadership must remain connected to service. A leader must never forget the people, must never become addicted to luxury while citizens suffer, must never treat power like personal ownership. Jesus taught leadership through humility, and humanity desperately needs that lesson again. Not only politicians, everyone, parents, teachers, businessmen, young people, communities, entire nations. We need to rediscover the courage to care about one another again. Without that, technology will not save us. Wealth will not save us. Military strength will not save us. Only moral renewal can preserve civilization long term. That renewal begins quietly, inside hearts, inside families, inside conscience, inside moments like the one Raymond experienced that night. A moment when truth breaks through exhaustion and reminds a human being that goodness still matters. Before I end this story, I want to leave people with one final thought. Never believe the world has become too dark for compassion. Never believe mercy has become weakness. Never believe sacrifice has lost meaning. The loudest voices in society are not always the wisest, and the most powerful people are not always the strongest. Sometimes the strongest people are those who refuse to let suffering destroy their humanity. That was the strength of Jesus, and perhaps that is the strength humanity needs most now. I pray for peace in the world. I pray for Africa. I pray for leaders everywhere to remember that authority without humility becomes dangerous. I pray for wounded people to rediscover hope before bitterness consumes them completely. And I pray for ordinary human beings never to forget their own dignity. Because every great change begins when people remember they are more than fear. If this story touched your heart, carry its message forward quietly in your own life. Speak truth. Protect dignity. Choose compassion when hatred feels easier. And if these words meant something to you, share your thoughts with others and continue walking with us as we search for a better future together. I speak these words not for applause, but because I believe humanity still has a choice between destruction and healing. And I still believe healing is possible. I am Ibrahim Traoré, and I speak these words with sincerity and conviction. I am Ibrahim Traoré, and before God and humanity, I believe these words are true. I am Ibrahim Traoré, and from the depths of my heart I tell you these things as truth.